Although I spoke about the movie Hereditary when it first came out last year on my open source Occult TV YouTube channel, I have yet to give the film any real in-depth review or presentation, and this video I will hope to make amends for this. The movie Hereditary was first brought to my attention by David Halpin of the Occult Book Review channel here on YouTube. I suggest you check that out. He just told me to basically go and see it. It had an effect on him. I saw the movie online. I didn't go to see it in the cinema. I wished I did, but I had several friends who did. The response to the film across the board was very interesting. Should I say, the more archetypally inclined friends of mine were greatly disturbed by the movie, as was I. I was left out of sorts, and not just in the immediate watching of the movie, but for several months later. I'm still to this point trapped within a kind of a psychic paradigm that film put me in the night I watched it, and I haven't been able to leave it, not in a negative or a traumatic manner, but the fact that the film affected me on that level so deeply. This analysis will contain spoilers, so if you haven't seen the film, you'd probably better shut off now. The film came out in 2018, and it was described as a psychological horror drama, and it was written and directed by a young American called Ari Aster, which is remarkable as it was his debut directorial film. The film featured Toni Collette, Alex Wolff, Millie Shapiro and Gabriel Byrne, an entire cast that produces a stellar performance. And this was one of the things I found interesting, that several people I knew laughed and mocked at the film, and they were quite intelligent people, or it was like they shrugged their shoulders and a meh kind of response to it. I found that very interesting, considering that the standard of acting and the individual performances by the actors was absolutely stellar by any standards, and yet they still found the film to be stupid or silly, besmirching the underlying narrative and presentation of the movie. Interesting enough, it was acclaimed by critics, which is surprising because it's not the kind of film they particularly like. And it would be very easy for me to say that we live in an age where people are dumbed down and they don't understand psychological horror drama in the same way, say, people in the 60s did with Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, or in the 70s with The Exorcist. But the fact that the film made an enormous profit of over $70 million in its first year shows that the public did take to Hereditary. Rob Ager on his Cognitive Learning channel did a fantastic review of Hereditary from a reductionist, straightforward point of view, dealing mainly with psychology. Mr. Ager does not believe in the occult, and that's his prerogative. This video is to basically come from the point of view of someone who doesn't only believe in the occult but has experienced it. The film's plot is about a woman called Annie Graham who lives in the associated world of building miniatures and miniaturized art in Utah. Her husband Steve, played by Gabriel Byrne, their 16-year-old son Peter, and their almost artistic, disconnected 13-year-old daughter Charlie. The film begins at the funeral of Annie's mother, a woman called Ellen. A eulogy is delivered by Annie, which is quite surprisingly dark in terms of her own dissociation from her mother and the lack of intimacy between the two. The mother seemed to live like so many people who have borderline personality or dissociative disorders in compartmentalized worlds, in clusters, in terms of both their macro and micro lives, and this was also symbolized by Annie's obsession with miniatures and small houses. Normally this would not be an unusual or sinister thing, but in this case of Annie, she's dealing with deep personality disorders, and she's unable to fully connect with her children, and in particular her eldest son. Following her mother's death, in order to deal with the bereavement, Annie goes to a support group, which at the time she doesn't know is made up of cult members. And this is one of the reasons I've often told people to be very wary of things such as support groups and even addictions groups. Often they're infiltrated, and I mean this completely seriously, they're infiltrated by cult members looking for people who suffer from dissociative issues, as they're easiest of all to program and infect. In fact, dissociative states are the threshold of what we would call demonic or shatanic possession. This is exactly what the CIA was attempting with the MK Ultra program. They were creating states of dissociation, and in that gap between the compartmentalized personalities within the disordered individual is where the pathological exterior force moves in and takes control. This happens at this support group. Later on in the film, their son Peter goes to a party. Annie forces him to take the 13-year-old daughter Charlie with him. He goes off and smokes weeds with his friend, and Charlie, who suffers from numerous allergies, eats a chocolate cake containing nuts and goes into shock. Peter drives her to the hospital. She's leaning out the car window in order to get air, and her head is smashed by a pole on the side of the road and decapitated, after Peter had tried to swerve around the dead deer. Put into his own dissociative state, Peter, in a state of shock, drives home and leaves the sister's corpse without the head in the back of the car, until the next morning. And one of the most powerful scenes is when Peter is lying in bed and he's waiting for the moment for his mother to walk out, open the car door and find her decapitated daughter. But his reaction is strange, because it's almost like he's subconsciously forced to do it. The family then goes into a state of dysfunction, her husband, played by Gabriel Byrne, being a weak male. As a result, she moves further away from Peter, indirectly and directly blaming him for the death of Charlie. One of the cult members at the support group, a woman called Joan, takes Annie and teaches her how to do a seance to communicate with Charlie. This is a minor demon that's been brought in. Purpose is to be the trickster, to fool Annie into believing that Charlie is connecting her from the afterlife. Believing that the seance was legit, Annie then convinces the family to also take part in their own seance, which terrifies Peter for different reasons than just merely being the ghost of his dead sister. Also, Annie seems to be possessed by some other entity until her husband Steve splashes her with water. At this point, Annie then believes that Charlie's spirit has become some kind of malevolent entity, and this is almost like a moment of revelation, that she doesn't quite understand demonology. She still thinks it's Charlie and doesn't actually know that it's this entity or this intermediate low-level demon playing upon Annie's dissociation, having been weaponized by Joan. A later visit to Joan's house, Annie notices that a strange motif on her welcome mat, which she has also seen in her mother's possessions, the sigil of Paimon, which the cult is invoking and want to bring into the body of Peter. Annie then goes through her mother's belonging and finds a picture linking her directly to Joan, and more information on the demon Paimon, who wishes to inhabit a male host. Eventually, in the attic, Annie finds her mother's decapitated body with more sigils written in blood. At school, Peter begins to have involuntary movements and what appears to be a form of epilepsy. At this point, Annie has woken up to the fact that there is a cult or a black magic element to all this. She begs Steve to burn the sketchbook so she can sacrifice herself to stop the haunting. Steve, believing she finally had an extreme nervous breakdown, accuses her of being the one who desecrated her mother's grave, which happened early on in the movie. Then Annie throws the sketchbook into the fireplace and her husband Steve bursts into flames. When Peter wakes up and comes down, he finds his father's body. The mother chases him in a very disturbing way into the attic, which then resembles a place of high occultic rites. Annie is now levitating at this point, and she eventually decapitates herself with a metal wire in the attic while the members look on. Peter, attempting to commit suicide, throws himself out the window, and then the blue light enters his body and he wakes up. He follows the floating decapitated corpse into Charlie's treehouse, and he's crowned king, surrounded by severed heads, and the coven members and the headless corpses of the mother and the grandmother bow to Peter, who is now King Paimon. Joan addresses him as Charlie, swears an oath to him as Paimon, and stating that he's been liberated from his female host and is free to rule over them all. Now, what is really going on here is quite a sophisticated storyline for a horror film. The writer obviously did his work here. The blue light is indeed significant because King Paimon, being in the service of Lucifer, is guided by and overseen by the light of Lucifer. Again, you have to understand that Paimon, along with Lucifer, are reinterpretations from the Hebrew side of pagan gods. Paimon almost certainly was a hermaphroditic pagan god from the Middle East, either Semitic or of Indo-European origin. This is important too. One of the reasons why Goetian demons function within a European context were ultimately based on pagan gods of our ancestors, and all entities, if you've seen my other work, read my book, either Sorcery or the Druid Code, are determined by the racial, this is not very politically correct to say it these days, but you carry within you a spiritual DNA as much as biological DNA. And therefore you would have entities such as the Lechauza, which lives on the borders of Mexico and the United States and is taken very seriously there, just like you would have the leprechauns in Ireland, just like you would have the elves in Iceland. Because of the initial pagan origin of the demons within the Goetia, remember Lucifer is an Indo-European god. This is why they work the European Western magical system, because they're ultimately pagan deities. This is also why they tend to go wrong. One of the reasons the cult within Hereditary is probably doomed is because they've invoked something they don't fully understand. Paimon is closer to a god than a demon, so you don't summon them, and that's basically what they've done. They should have invoked him, as was seen in the film A Dark Song, which was another excellent film about the magical process. Paimon is chocolate, and this is why we see Charlie constantly eating bars of chocolate throughout the early stages of the movie before her decapitation. And this was also the trick to lure her into taking nuts in order to kill her, so the spirit of Paimon could enter the male body. And again, this is just proof of the writer and director's research in that we do have the hermaphroditic nature of Paimon expressed by the transference of the entity from Charlie into Peter. Now I want to talk about the actual effect that the movie had. I felt quite dissociative myself following the movie Hereditary, and so did other people I know. It was almost as if that film had changed reality in and of itself. In a way it had, because it was finally the movie that was never made that had finally been made. And I think this is why the film has affected people so deeply, and will be seen in years to come the same way Stanley Kubrick's film 2001: A Space Odyssey has seeped into the consciousness and become a fertile plain of hidden elements and manifested insights, self-generative over the decades. Hereditary has all the makings of that, but it's also a film like The Occult. It's not suited for everyone. Much of the laughing that went on, that took place with some people who watched the film, is because it's probably their subconscious mind trying to block them out, almost like another form of dissociation, creating a screen memory of a stupid film so their consciousness and their psyche didn't have to come to terms with just how powerful and psychologically and emotionally and spiritually intense the film of Hereditary actually is. The film tells us much about modern society. Annie's dissociative behaviour is very much central to Western civilization in the politically correct age. You see this with the social justice warriors and what they call the NPCs, why they're often compared to blank slates, even though these kinds of people will dress themselves up flamboyantly, dye their hair, cut off or alter their sex organs, adopt numerous genders. What's really happening is they're in the dissociative state waiting for the new programming to come in. And this is also why Hereditary left such a big cultural impression upon people. It is a reflection of what's happening to Western society at the moment. In many ways, in the post 9/11 era, we are as a species Annie. We have been made dissociative. The Twin Towers coming down was the decapitation of Charlie for us as collectively as a people, and we've not been right ever since. And as the culture makers and the overall zeitgeist of the collective unconscious scrambles to try and create order out of that chaos, in the meantime, the dissociative state of the Western people is very, very well represented in the film Hereditary. I do believe we are facing towards something quite dark. It will be like the Kali Yuga in the Vedic tradition, but at the very end there will be a complete reorganization of the human condition at the psychic and spiritual level. Look around you, it's already happening. In many ways, Hereditary represents that, and in fact, the occult as a whole does. Anyone who has a deep interest or engagement with the occult or paganism becomes very aware that life is basically a ballet of archetypal synchronicity, where everything is read in signs and symbols, and a metaphor is more real than an event, and a mythology is more accurate than a historical record. And I think that distinguished the difference between the people who were deeply affected by Hereditary and those who just were either apathetic or thought it was rather silly. The film Hereditary will probably go down as one of the greatest movies ever made, although it will also go down as one of the most challenging, because the movie ultimately is about us as a species, reflected in the story of a dysfunctional family being used to bring a demon to Earth. And who knows, maybe the demon is the extraterrestrials, maybe the demon is something like Project Bluebeam. But our collective pieman is on the horizon. And a movie such as Hereditary, what it really tells us is, pay attention.